Gothic romance is well known for its dark settings, harsh lovers, and extreme passion. These tropes have long been a facet of the genre, to be sure, but they have evolved over time. Of all of the tropes utilized in Gothic romance, perhaps the most prominent is the intensity of the lovers. Many scholars have studied the dynamics of these relationships, from the dangerous passions of Wuthering Heights' Catherine and Heathcliff to the overarching paternalism present in the relationship between Jane Eyre and Rochester. In early Gothic romances, the relationships are not perfect, but as the Gothic romance evolves over time, it depicts increasingly dangerous relationships. Beyond simply being flawed, these relationships are toxic. It is important to note the difference between abusive relationships and toxic relationships for the purposes of this presentation. There are examples of abusive relationships in these novels, to be sure, but the primary romantic relationships do not extend into abuse. This is not to say that their behavior is always acceptable, of course, as toxic relationships can be equally as harmful as abusive ones, but they manifest in different ways. While there is some overlap, the primary difference is about control. In an abusive relationship, the abuser acts in a deliberate manner in order to maintain control over the other person. Abusive behavior is calculated. Toxic relationships, on the other hand, are less about a deliberate bid for power and more about how one or both parties respond to a situation. Toxic behavior is based in a disproportionate action and reaction cycle, more often based in emotion than abusive behavior is. For these intensely passionate Gothic characters, it is clear that they are driven by heightened emotion more than the desire to gain control over their partner, and when they act out, it is, as they themselves say, because they allowed their emotions to get the better of them. A healthy relationship, then, would refer to one in which there is an equal distribution of power, and the basic structure of the relationship satisfies the deepest personal needs and goals of both parties. In other words, both partners must benefit from the relationship without inflicting harm in order for it to be considered healthy. The 18th century Gothic romances are by far the tamest, though the nature of the genre still requires more than a little bit of danger. Here, however, the two worlds of danger and romance are kept almost completely separate. In Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, the virtuous Emily finds herself under the guardianship of her cruel uncle Montoni, who entraps both her and her aunt in an attempt to steal their inheritance. Valancourt, a mostly virtuous young man, loves Emily and endeavors to show it through gentleness and open communication. He is kept so separate from anything antithetical to Emily's safety and happiness that he never even interacts with the villain directly. Meanwhile, the villainous Montoni displays unrepentant cruelty and coldness in everything he does. He remains firmly in control at all times and ensures Emily and her aunt remember that he has ultimate power over both of them. The stakes in Jane Eyre's Northanger Abbey, a parody of Radcliffe's novel, are much lower as this novel centers around a simple clergyman's daughter, Catherine, traveling to the large estate of a new acquaintance, where she subsequently sees danger and mystery around every corner as a result of her fascination with Gothic novels. Despite the lowered stakes, it nevertheless illustrates the focus of the 18th century Gothic romance, as well as preludes later developments in the genre. Northanger Abbey contains slightly less separation between love interest and villain, as the villain is love interest Tilney's father. However, here too, Tilney respects Catherine as much as he loves her, and his behavior makes that clear. Well known as the Gothic genre is for its dangerous passions, neither one of these novels has yet reached the point of danger, and the passion is likewise rather minimal. Instead, Valancourt and Tilney act as Emily and Catherine's solace against the dangers that plague them. Likewise, their rivals straddle the line between lover and villain, but remain much closer to villain than lover. As far as the romance is concerned, there is no conflict for the heroines in terms of which man she should be with, but rather how she can find a way to be with the man she wants. The rival love interests are opponents to the heroines just as much as to the primary love interest. The true danger comes not from the love interest, but from the outside of the romantic relationship. The love interest, for his part, acts almost as the heroine's reward for remaining pure. The 19th century marks a distinct shift in the dynamic between the heroine and her primary love interest. While the 18th century Gothic romance centers around an innocent romantic heroine being persecuted by a powerful villain while working her way toward a marriage with a romantic hero, in the 19th century the outside Gothic villain disappears entirely. In order to make up for this change, the love interest morphs into a more Byronic hero, in some ways taking the place of the villain of earlier novels. Whereas in the previous novels, the love interest serves as a refuge from outside dangers, here the love interest begins to act as a danger in and of himself. As a result, the opposition to a happy marriage now comes from him. Likewise, Charlotte Bronte's eponymous Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Cathy of Wuthering Heights deviate from the paragons of purity found in the 18th century. They are wilder now, more independent, and even, in Cathy's case, with a propensity for cruelty. In contrast to the 18th century, 19th century romances value emotion for its own sake, the deeper and more extreme the better, a concept which is reflected in the almost dangerously passionate romances. The moments of miscommunication present in 18th century Gothic romances become much more central in the 19th century, to the point where it becomes much more difficult to identify the romances as healthy overall. Meanwhile, the Gothic villain has been removed from the narrative entirely. The heroine may still encounter danger and mystery, but they come instead from the love interest himself. In Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Jane falls in love with the ill-tempered master of the house in which she works as a governess. Though his temper and his secrets, most significantly his mad wife living in the attic, initially endanger their relationship, they eventually manage to come together, albeit with less explicit harmony than in the 18th century. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights takes this even further, as both Cathy and Heathcliff are temperamental, even outright cruel at times, and their frequent misinterpretations of the other's behavior contribute to the toxic nature of their entire relationship. Passion becomes central to the romance, contributing to the toxicity of the primary romances, as well as serving as the main reason for the rival suitor's ultimate rejection. In the 20th century, the merging of roles that began in the 19th century becomes even more overt, with characters seeming to play multiple roles at different parts of the story. The Gothic villain returns, but in a much less clear-cut way than before. In Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, the unnamed narrator falls in love with Maxim de Winter, a widower twice her age. They marry, but when she arrives at Manderley, his estate, she is tormented by the cruel housekeeper Mrs. Danvers and the memory of his beautiful first wife, Rebecca. Maxim acts as both the love interest and the villain as the narrator's perspective shifts, while Rebecca, Maxim's first wife, almost seems to be the heroine of a previous story, while also being perceived by Maxim and the narrator as the villain of this one, though as she is dead from the beginning of the novel, she cannot actually act as either. Sarah Waters takes the merging of roles a step further in Fingersmith. With the help of a thief known as Gentleman, young thief Susan poses as maid to the apparently naive heiress Maud Lily in order to steal her fortune and lock her up in a madhouse. Unbeknownst to her, Maud is also working with Gentleman to lock Susan up in a madhouse under Maud's name so that she can escape her uncle. Despite their intentions, the two each develop romantic feelings for each other, though it does not stop them from continuing their respective roles in the plots. Both Susan and Maud act as the heroine of their own stories, as well as both love interest and villain to the other. 20th century Gothic novels take the uncertainty that already existed in the genre and expand on it so that it becomes central to the plot of the novel itself. The toxicity emerges in Rebecca through their constant lack of communication or understanding. The heroine is incredibly naive and insecure, and she constantly doubts whether Maxim has any affection for her at all, a fact which he does not help by never once telling her he loves her until he confesses that he shot his first wife. Instead, he lashes out at her repeatedly, interpreting meaningless comments as intentional attacks and letting her apologize and beg for forgiveness without knowing what she has done wrong. The narrator, for her part, hinges her entire sense of self-worth on the success of her marriage. Though it takes different forms for each partner, the toxicity here is mutual. In Fingersmith, though both Susan and Maud are each working against the other, they display only slight guilt or acknowledgement of their own wrongdoing, but lash out and assign greater intent to the other at the first sign of her scheming. Fingersmith, then, openly defies the reader to question what makes one a heroine or a villain, a love interest or a victim, as both Susan and Maud play all of these roles at different points throughout the novel. While the toxic elements of earlier Gothic romances are almost taken for granted, by the end of the 20th century, Gothic novelists finally begin to question the nature of the genre itself. While the passion that has long since overtaken every facet of the Gothic romance remains, the toxic elements of the romance no longer appear as a part of the passion, but instead as a true hindrance.